Hey guys, welcome back to another mind-blowing historical nightmare that'll destroy every romantic fantasy you had about the Middle Ages. Tonight we're diving into the late 14th century, when there were two popes fighting for legitimacy while England and France tore each other apart in a century-long war that devastated entire generations. Before we start, smash that like button if you've ever wondered what it's like when your immortal soul is at stake because nobody can agree which pope is real. Subscribe for more time-traveling chaos through history's worst periods. And drop a comment, Rome Pope or Avignon Pope, which would you choose when both claim divine authority and both threaten you with hell? Now, get comfortable. Maybe say a prayer to whichever pope you prefer, and let's discover what really happens when you wake up in 14th century France during the Great Schism and the 100 Years' War. A period so catastrophically bad that modern problems look like minor inconveniences. Your eyes open to darkness so complete that for a moment you think you've gone blind. The air is thick with smells that assault your modern sensibilities. Smoke from a dying fire, unwashed bodies, animal waste, rotting straw, and the general organic stench of a medieval dwelling that's never been properly cleaned because the concept of hygiene as you know it won't exist for centuries. You're lying on something that might generously be called a bed. A wooden frame with rope supports covered by a thin straw mattress that's lumpy, scratchy, and probably infested with lice, fleas, and other parasites that will make your life miserable. As your eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through cracks in the wooden shutters, you realize you're in a single-room dwelling with earthen floor, rough stone walls, and a thatched roof that's leaking in several places. The furniture consists of a crude wooden table, a few stools, some shelves with pottery vessels, and agricultural tools leaning against the walls. This isn't poverty by medieval standards. This is normal life for the vast majority of people in 14. You're not in a castle or manor house, you're in a peasant cottage, and the realization hits you that you're at the bottom of the feudal hierarchy with all the suffering and powerlessness that entails. You're wearing clothing that feels rough and uncomfortable against your skin. A simple wool tunic that's coarse, scratchy, and probably hasn't been washed in weeks or months. Wool hose that itch terribly, and leather shoes that are poorly made and already hurting your feet even though you've barely moved. Your modern body is accustomed to soft cotton, synthetic fabrics, and climate control. The rough medieval clothing and primitive living conditions are immediately uncomfortable in ways that will only get worse as you experience the full reality of 14. Other people are in the room with you, a family sleeping on similar straw mattresses. Their breathing audible in the pre-dawn silence. A woman who might be your wife or sister, several children of various ages, possibly an elderly parent, all crammed into this single room where privacy doesn't exist and where every aspect of life from sleeping to eating to sexual activity happens in communal space that would be intolerable to modern sensibilities about personal boundaries and private life. But the physical discomfort and poverty of your surroundings are nothing compared to the existential crisis you're about to discover. Because this isn't just any period in medieval history, this is the late 14th century during the Great Schism and the 100 Years' War, a time when the very foundations of European civilization are cracking and nobody knows if they'll survive or if they're even going to heaven when they die because the church itself is broken, and nobody can agree on which pope is legitimate. And then someone in the room stirs and begins speaking to you in a language that sounds like French but which is so different from modern French that you can barely understand a word. First realization. The two popes problem. The woman you're sharing this hovel with, definitely your wife based on how she addresses you, begins talking about the most urgent concern in medieval life, religious obligation. But what she says makes no sense to your modern understanding. We must decide soon which pope to follow, or our souls will be damned. You stare at her in confusion because there's supposed to be only one pope, right? That's the whole point of having a pope. Singular authority over the Catholic Church that speaks with the voice of God on earth. But she continues, her voice anxious and frightened in ways that make clear this isn't theoretical debate. This is life or death spiritual crisis. Father Bernard supports the Pope in Rome, but Lord Guillaume has declared for the Pope in Avignon. If we choose wrong, we'll be excommunicated and condemned to hell for eternity. But if we choose right but our Lord chooses wrong, we'll be punished in this life even if we're saved in the next. What are we supposed to do? The full horror of the situation begins to dawn on you as she explains the Great Schism in terrified whispers. In 1378 the cardinals elected Pope Urban VI in Rome, but then a group of French cardinals declared that election invalid and elected a rival Pope, Clement VII, who set up his papacy in Avignon, France. Now there are two popes, each claiming to be the one true head of the church, each excommunicating the other, and all his followers, each demanding taxes and obedience, and each insisting that following the rival pope means eternal damnation. This isn't like modern religious disagreements where different denominations coexist and you can choose your preferred interpretation. In 14th century Europe there's supposed to be one universal church, one pope, one path to salvation. The existence of two competing popes has shattered that certainty, leaving every Christian in Europe facing an impossible choice: follow Rome or follow Avignon, with your immortal soul at stake and no way to know for certain which one is legitimate. Get it wrong, and you'll burn in hell forever. But the consequences of choosing go beyond the afterlife. Your earthly Lord has made his choice, and if you choose differently, you could face punishment, excommunication by the local bishop, loss of property, or worse. Your wife is crying now, terrified by the impossible situation. The priest says one thing, but the traveling friar says another. Our neighbors are divided, families are torn apart over this, and meanwhile the English are coming again and the harvest failed last year, and the taxes keep increasing because both popes demand money. And I don't know if we'll survive the winter even if we somehow manage to save our soul. But before you can process the religious crisis, you need to understand who you are in this nightmare scenario, and what your position means for your survival. Meeting your medieval family and understanding your status. As the household wakes and morning routines begin, you piece together your identity in this medieval world. You're a villain, not quite a slave, but not really free either, bound to the land of a local lord and obligated to provide labor and various fees in exchange for the protection and justice that the feudal system theoretically provides, but which in practice means you're trapped in grinding poverty while nobles and clergy live in relative luxury funded by your suffering. Your wife, her name is something like Jehan or Margaret. You're not quite sure because medieval pronunciation is difficult, is exhausted and aged beyond her years despite probably being only in her late 20s. She's already buried 3 children who died in infancy or early childhood from diseases, malnutrition, or accidents that modern medicine could have easily prevented. The surviving children, 4 of them ranging from about 3 to 12 years old, are malnourished, poorly clothed, and already working in the fields or around the household because childhood as a time of play and education doesn't exist for peasant children. Are small adults who must contribute to family survival from the moment they're physically capable. An elderly man in the corner, probably your father or father-in-law, coughs constantly, a wet rattling sound that suggests lung disease or consumption that will kill him soon because medieval medicine is worse than useless, and will likely hasten his death with treatments like bloodletting and purging. He survived to old age through sheer luck, but now he's a burden on the family, unable to work but still needing to eat from the limited food supply. Your dwelling is one of perhaps 30 similar cottages clustered around a manor house where your lord lives in what seems like luxury compared to your hovel, but which is still primitive and uncomfortable by modern standards. The village is surrounded by fields where you and your fellow villains labor to grow crops that mostly go to the lord, the church and the king's tax collectors, leaving barely enough for your own survival. Beyond the fields is forest that you're forbidden to hunt in. That's the lord's private hunting ground, and poaching can be punished by death, maiming, or other brutal penalties even though you're starving and there's plenty of game. This is your life, endless agricultural labor during growing season, desperate attempts to store enough food and firewood for winter, religious obligations and fees that drain your resources, the constant threat of violence from soldiers both English and French, and the ever-present fear that you'll die unshriven and go to hell because nobody can agree which pope has the authority to grant absolution. You have no money, no education, no legal rights that matter, no way to leave this village without permission, and no hope that life will get better, because the feudal system is designed to keep you in your place forever, while extracting maximum labor and resources from you until you die young and exhausted. And just when you're trying to accept this horrifying reality, someone bursts into the cottage with news that makes everything worse. English soldiers have been spotted nearby, and the village might be in the path of another chevauchée, the terrifying English tactic of burning, looting and destroying everything in their path. Understanding the papal split and its implications. Over the next few days, as you attempt to navigate your new medieval life while being completely unprepared for its physical hardships and social complexities, you begin to understand the full depth of the Great Schism and why it's causing such existential terror throughout Christian Europe. This isn't just a political dispute or a theological disagreement that intellectuals debate in universities. This is a crisis that affects every single person's daily life and eternal fate in ways that are impossible for modern secular people to fully comprehend. The timeline is this. Pope Gregory XI died in 1378 after returning the papacy to Rome from its long Babylonian captivity in Avignon, France. The cardinals elected Urban VI as his successor, But Urban's behavior was so erratic and harsh, possibly due to mental illness or personality disorders, that the French cardinals declared his election invalid and elected Clement VII instead, who promptly fled to Avignon and set up a rival papacy. Now there are two papal courts, two sets of cardinals, two bureaucracies issuing conflicting decrees, and two men claiming to be the divinely appointed successor of Saint Peter with exclusive authority over all Christians. The split isn't random, it follows political lines that make the religious crisis inseparable from the 100 Years' War. France, Scotland, Castile, Aragon and several other kingdoms recognize the Avignon Pope, Clement VII, while England, the Holy Roman Empire, most of Italy, and various other states recognize the Rome Pope, Urban. Your choice of pope isn't just a religious decision, it's a political statement that could mark you as a traitor to your kingdom or your local lord, with consequences ranging from social ostracism to execution. But the truly terrifying aspect is the spiritual implications. Both popes claim that the other is an anti-pope, a false teacher leading Christians astray. Both have excommunicated each other, and everyone who follows the rival pope. This means that half of Christian Europe is, according to the other half, in a state of mortal sin and heading for eternal damnation. There's no way to know for certain which pope is legitimate. Both have plausible claims, both have the support of respected theologians and powerful kingdoms, and both seem equally convinced of their divine right to the papacy. The village priest, Father Bernard, a tired middle-aged man who seems overwhelmed by the impossible situation, tries to explain the theological arguments during Sunday Mass, but it's clear he's confused and frightened himself. He supports the Rome Pope, because that's what the bishop has instructed and because Urban VI was technically elected first, but he admits that the Avignon Pope's arguments have merit too, and he doesn't know what will happen to his own soul if he's backed the wrong horse in this cosmic race for salvation, and the practical consequences of the schism are making daily life even more unbearable than it would normally be in medieval time. Your choice determines your soul. The impossible decision, the pressure to choose which pope to follow is intense and comes from multiple directions, each with its own threats and incentives. Your feudal lord, Guillaume de something or other, medieval names are hard to follow, has declared for the Avignon Pope, because that's the official position of the French crown and because most French nobles support Avignon for nationalistic reasons. He's made clear that any of his villains who openly support the Rome Pope will be considered rebels and could face punishment ranging from extra labor obligations to expulsion from the village, which would be a death sentence since you have nowhere else to go. But the local bishop supports the Rome Pope, creating a contradiction where secular authority and religious authority are pulling in opposite directions. Father Bernard takes his orders from the bishop, so technically the religious instruction you're receiving supports Rome even though your feudal obligations require supporting Avignon. The cognitive dissonance is maddening. Go to confession and follow the priest's guidance supporting Rome, but pay your taxes and perform your labor for a lord who supports Avignon and might punish you for following the priest. Your neighbors are divided, and it's tearing the village apart. Some families support Rome out of genuine religious conviction or because they distrust anything French, even though they are French. The complications of medieval identity are beyond confusing. Others support Avignon out of political loyalty or because they believe the French cardinal's argument that Urban VI's election was coerced by the Roman mob. Still others are trying to avoid taking a position, hoping to somehow satisfy both sides or at least avoid punishment from either. But that fence-sitting is becoming increasingly untenable as the schism drags on and pressure mounts to declare loyalty. The economic burden is crushing. Both papal courts need money to maintain their operations, pay their supporters, and fight their propaganda war against the rival pope. This means taxes and fees are effectively doubled. You're expected to pay tithes and various ecclesiastical fees to support both the Rome-aligned bishop and the Avignon-aligned royal court. The church was already extracting significant wealth from impoverished peasants through tithes, fees for sacraments, payments for indulgences and various other mechanisms. But now you're being hit from both sides while your actual income and food supply haven't increased. Your wife is terrified about what happens when you die. If we choose wrong, or if the priest who gives you last rites is following the wrong pope, you won't receive valid absolution and you'll go straight to hell. How can we know? What if we spend our whole lives trying to be good Christians, and then at the moment of death we find out we've been following a false pope and all our prayers and confessions were worthless? This isn't abstract theological debate. For medieval people who genuinely believe in heaven and hell and who view death, which could come at any moment from disease, accident, violence or starvation, as the most important transition in existence. The uncertainty about which sacraments are valid is psychological torture, but while you're wrestling with this impossible religious crisis that affects your eternal soul, there's an equally pressing threat to your physical survival. The 100 Years' War is destroying the countryside around you, and English soldiers are coming, cause religious chaos everywhere. You look, the Great Schism doesn't just affect grand political matters and papal elections. It's woven into every aspect of daily medieval life in ways that create constant stress and confusion. Church services are filled with prayers for the true Pope, but which one? And against the anti-Pope and his followers. But what if your Lord is one of those followers? Hymns and rituals that used to unite the community in shared worship now divide people based on which pope they think should be mentioned in the liturgy. Marriages are complicated by the question of which pope's authority validates the sacrament. If you were married by a priest loyal to Rome but your Lord supports Avignon, is your marriage valid? If your children were baptized by a priest who later switched his allegiance from Avignon to Rome, are they actually baptized in the eyes of the church, or do they need to be rebaptized? These aren't theoretical questions when the state of your soul and your children's souls hangs in the balance. Saints' feast days and religious holidays have become contentious. Different popes are canonizing different saints and declaring different feast days, so the religious calendar is diverging between Rome and Avignon jurisdiction. You're expected to observe feast days declared by both sides, which effectively doubles your religious obligations, and the days when you're not supposed to work, cutting into the limited time available for the agricultural labor that keeps you from starving. Indulgences, the payment system where you can reduce your time in purgatory or gain forgiveness for sins by giving money to the church, have become even more corrupt and confusing. Both papal courts are selling indulgences, both claiming that only their indulgences are valid and the other sides are worthless fraud. You're being pressured to buy indulgences from both sides, effectively paying twice for the same spiritual benefit, and you have no way to know if either one is actually helping your soul, or if you're just being scammed by corrupt clergy exploiting the confusion. The breakdown of religious certainty is affecting medieval society in profound ways. Some people are becoming more fanatically devoted to their chosen pope, desperately clinging to certainty in an uncertain world. Others are becoming cynical about the church entirely, questioning whether corrupt institutions fighting over power and money have anything to do with genuine spirituality or salvation. Still others are falling into despair, convinced that the schism is a sign of the end times, and that the apocalypse is imminent, which at least would resolve the question of which pope is legitimate when Christ returns to judge everyone. And just as you think things can't possibly get worse, you hear the news that truly terrifies every peasant in France during this period. English soldiers have been spotted less than a day's march from your village, and they're practicing chevauchée, the systematic destruction of everything in their path.
English versus French, the endless war, nobody can win. The 100 Years' War isn't actually one continuous war, but rather a series of conflicts, truces, and renewed hostilities between England and France that began in 1337 and won't end until making it literally longer than a human lifetime, and meaning that people are born, live their entire lives, and die never knowing peace. The causes are complex, and involve English kings' claims to the French throne, disputes over French territories controlled by English nobility, economic conflicts over the wool trade and Flemish cloth industry, and the general feudal system's tendency to generate aristocratic wars that devastate peasant populations who have no say in the conflicts but bear all the suffering. By the time you've landed in this nightmare, probably somewhere around 1381 or 1400, the war has been going on for several generations, and has settled into a devastating pattern. English forces, unable to conquer and hold French territory permanently due to limited manpower and resources, instead conduct chevauchée raids, military expeditions that march through French territory, burning villages, destroying crops, slaughtering livestock, terrorizing civilians, and generally making the land economically worthless to the French crown, while enriching English soldiers through plunder and ransom. The current phase of the war features English longbowmen who have achieved devastating victories at battles like Crécy and Poitiers, demonstrating that common soldiers with bows can defeat French knights in armor through superior tactics and firepower. This has undermined the feudal military system's assumption that armored cavalry is invincible and that nobility is inherent military superiority. But it hasn't ended the war. It's just made it more brutal and unpredictable, with English forces able to defeat much larger French armies while French nobles desperately try to figure out how to counter the longbow threat. Your village's position in northeastern France means you're in the path of English armies moving from their bases in Calais and other coastal strongholds toward interior French territory. You're not near any major cities or fortifications that might offer protection. You're an agricultural countryside that's considered legitimate military target because destroying your crops and livestock weakens France's ability to feed its armies and pay for the war. The fact that this also starves peasant families who have nothing to do with the conflict is considered acceptable collateral damage by military commanders on both sides who view commoners as expendable resources rather than people with inherent worth. The French Royal Army is somewhere else, protecting more important targets or avoiding battle with English forces they can't defeat. Your feudal lord's military obligations mean he's probably away serving in some campaign, leaving the village defended only by a handful of elderly men and boys too young or too poor to be equipped as proper soldiers. The local manor house has a small garrison, but they're more focused on protecting the lord's property than defending peasant cottages. And besides, a dozen poorly equipped men-at-arms can't stop a chevauchee force that might number in the hundreds or thousands. And the horrifying reality is that your only warning of approaching English soldiers might be smoke on the horizon from the previous village they've already destroyed. Your village in the war zone, terror approaching, panic that's not irrational medieval superstition, but rather learned fear based on previous experiences and stories from survivors of other chevauchés. The English don't distinguish between combatants and civilians, between military targets and agricultural community. Their strategy is total war against the French economy and population, burning everything that can burn, killing or stealing livestock, destroying grain stores and agricultural tools, sometimes killing villagers or taking them prisoner for ransom, if they seem wealthy enough to be worth keeping alive. Some villagers want to flee into the forest or nearby marshes, hoping to hide until the English pass by, but that's risky for multiple reasons. The English often split into smaller raiding parties to cover more ground, so you might encounter soldiers even in supposedly safe hiding places. Abandoning your home means leaving behind everything you own: tools, food stores, clothing, which could mean death by starvation or exposure even if you survive the immediate raid. And if your lord or his officials discover you fled, you might be punished for cowardice or suspected of desertion, with consequences ranging from fines you can't afford to accusations of treason. Others argue for staying and hoping the English will pass by without stopping. After all, your village is small and poor, without obvious plunder worth the effort of thorough destruction. Maybe if you hide anything valuable and make the village look abandoned or already raided, the English will move on to richer targets. But this strategy has obvious risks. English soldiers might stop anyway out of thoroughness or boredom, and if they discover you're hiding things or that the village isn't actually abandoned, they might punish the deception with extra brutality. A few villagers advocate trying to negotiate or pay off the English, offering food and goods in exchange for leaving the village intact. But this requires having something valuable to offer and trusting that English commanders will honor agreements with peasants they view as beneath contempt. Moreover, paying the English might be seen as collaboration or treason by French authorities, leading to punishment after the English leave, and there's no guarantee that paying one English unit will protect you from the next one that comes through next week or next month. The manor house garrison is preparing for a siege, pulling back behind the small fortifications and preparing to defend the lord's property, but they've made clear they won't risk their lives defending peasant cottages. You're essentially on your own, with no military force willing to protect you, no place to flee that's truly safe, and no good options for dealing with professional soldiers who are equipped, trained, and legally authorized to destroy your home and kill you if you resist. Your wife is hysterical, the children are crying, and you're paralyzed by the realization that your modern knowledge is completely useless in this situation. You can't call the police because police don't exist. You can't sue for protection under rule of law because rule of law doesn't apply to peasants. You can't appeal to human rights or war crimes tribunals because those concepts won't be invented for centuries. You're trapped in a system where violence against civilians is accepted military practice, where your life has no legal protection, and where your only options are bad choices that might get you killed or slightly less bad choices that might let you survive to face the next crisis. And then someone shouts that they can see smoke rising from the next village over. The English are already burning their way through the countryside, and you have perhaps hours or less before they reach you. Soldier, mercenaries and death coming to your door. The English army approaching your village isn't a unified professional force under strict discipline. It's a mixture of English knights and men-at-arms, Welsh longbowmen, foreign mercenaries and camp followers, all loosely organized under various commanders who have their own agendas and who exercise varying levels of control over their troops. The chevauché tactic essentially gives soldiers free rein to plunder and destroy, which attracts the worst kind of violent opportunists, looking for easy loot and sanctioned violence against helpless civilians. Medieval warfare allows soldiers to keep most of what they plunder, with only a portion going to their commanders and the king, so there's strong economic incentive to maximize destruction and theft during raids. Poor knights hoping to improve their financial situation, common soldiers looking to return home wealthy, and landless younger sons seeking their fortune all see French villages as legitimate targets for enrichment. The fact that this impoverishes French peasants and makes the land unproductive is the entire point from the English strategic perspective, weakening France's economic base. Mercenaries are even worse than regular soldiers because they have no national loyalty or institutional discipline beyond whatever their immediate employer enforces, and in the chaos of a chevauché where looting is encouraged, they're essentially armed bandits with legal cover for their crime. Many mercenaries are routiers, unemployed soldiers from previous campaigns who form free companies that fight for whoever pays them and support themselves through pillaging when not under contract. They're feared even by the armies that employ them because they're violent, undisciplined, and prone to atrocity. As the English approach, you face the grim reality that there's no honorable surrender, no protection of civilian status, no way to signal non-combatant status that will make you safe. If you resist, you'll be killed. If you don't resist, you might be killed anyway, or robbed, or taken prisoner, or have your home burned while you watch. Women face the additional terror of sexual violence that's common during medieval warfare. Rape is so routine that it's barely mentioned in chronicles, except when it's particularly egregious or involves noble women whose violation matters to the male chronicle. The English soldiers appear on the horizon. You can see the glint of armor, the movement of mounted knights, the mass of foot soldiers spreading out to surround a village and prevent escape. They're shouting in English and some kind of Welsh or Gascon dialect, none of which you understand even if you did speak medieval French properly. The smoke from burning buildings in nearby villages has created a haze that makes the scene even more apocalyptic, and you realize that this might be the day you die violently and pointlessly, in a war you don't understand, fighting for causes that have nothing to do with you, punished for being in the wrong place at the wrong time in the wrong century. Your village's fate is about to be decided by men who view you as less than human, in a world where might makes right and peasant lives are worth less than the livestock they tend.
Your role in the feudal system. Property, not person. The feudal system that governs every aspect of your medieval life isn't just an economic arrangement or a political structure. It's a comprehensive worldview that defines your identity, your rights or lack thereof, your obligation, and your value as a human being, in ways that would be incomprehensible and horrifying to modern people, raised with notions of individual rights and human dignity. You're not a citizen with legal protections. You're a villain, which is essentially property attached to the land, and your lord owns your labor, your movement, and effectively your life. As a villain, you're legally bound to the land of your lord's manor and cannot leave without permission that will rarely be granted, because your labor is valuable, and your lord has no incentive to let you go seek better opportunities elsewhere. This isn't slavery in the Roman sense where you can be sold separately from the land, but it's not freedom either. It's a middle status where you have some protections and customary rights, but fundamentally lack the autonomy and mobility that define free status in medieval society. If your lord sells the manor, you're transferred with it like livestock or agricultural equipment. Your labor obligations are extensive and precisely defined by custom. You must work your lord's demesne land, the portion he farms directly, for a certain number of days per week, probably 3 days during normal season, more during harvest when every hand is needed. This corvée labor is unpaid and takes priority over working your own small plot of land that the Lord graciously allows you to farm for your family's subsistence. The best days and best hours go to the Lord's fields, leaving you to work your own plot in whatever time remains, often in darkness or poor weather, always exhausted. You owe various fees and payments in kind. A portion of your harvest goes to the Lord as rent for your plot. Eggs, chickens, or other goods must be provided at certain times. You must pay to use the Lord's mill to grind grain, and you're forbidden from grinding it yourself, or using another mill, ensuring the Lord's monopoly and income. You owe fees when your daughter marries or when you die, and your son inherits your obligations. You must provide carts and animals for the Lord's use when required, and countless other customary obligations that vary by region but which all serve to extract maximum value from your labor, while leaving you with minimal resources for survival. You're not a person with rights in any meaningful sense. You're a resource to be exploited, and the feudal system is designed to keep you in that position permanent. Lords, knights and peasants. The three orders of society. Medieval social theory divides society into three orders or estates, each with supposedly divinely ordained functions. Those who pray, clergy; those who fight, nobility; and those who work, peasants, which includes you. This three estates model isn't just a description of social reality, it's an ideological justification for inequality that claims your suffering and exploitation are part of God's plan for human society, and that questioning the system is questioning divine will itself. The nobility, your lord and the knights and noble families above him in the feudal hierarchy, are supposed to provide military protection and just governance in exchange for the labor and resources extracted from peasants. The theory claims this is a reciprocal relationship where each estate benefits from the others. Nobles protect peasants from violence, clergy provides spiritual guidance and intercession with God, and peasants provide the food and material goods that allow the other two estates to perform their specialized functions without having to farm themselves. The reality is far less balanced and reciprocal. The protection nobles provide is often inadequate or non-existent, as you're discovering now with English soldiers approaching and your lord's garrison unwilling to defend peasant villages. The justice administered by noble lords is arbitrary, biased in favor of those with status and money, and more concerned with maintaining order and extracting resources than with fairness or protecting the weak. The system is designed to benefit the top two estates at the expense of the working estate, and questioning this arrangement is considered both sinful, because it contradicts the God-ordained social order, and treasonous, because it threatens the power of those who control the legal and military apparatus. Knights, who occupy a middle position in the military aristocracy, are supposed to embody chivalric ideals of honor, courage, protection of the weak, and Christian virtue. The reality is that most knights are minor nobles or sons of wealthy families who use their military training and equipment primarily to extract wealth from peasants through violence, or the threat of violence. The romantic image of knights as noble heroes saving damsels and fighting for justice is propaganda created by and for the aristocracy. The actual behavior of most knights toward peasants ranges from indifferent to exploitative to actively brutal. The clergy, meanwhile, are supposed to be intercessors between humans and God, providing spiritual guidance, administering sacraments, and praying for everyone's salvation. But the Great Schism has exposed deep corruption and self-interest within the church hierarchy, and even before the schism many clergy were more concerned with accumulating wealth and power than with spiritual matter. The village priest might be genuinely pious and concerned for his parishioners' souls, but he's part of a larger ecclesiastical system that's extracting tithes, fees and resources from impoverished peasants to fund luxurious papal courts, elaborate cathedrals, and the comfortable lives of bishops and abbots who've never done physical labor. And you're at the absolute bottom of this pyramid, supporting everyone above you through your labor while receiving minimal protection or benefit in return. Daily survival in wartime. When everything gets worse, you eat a meager breakfast of bread and perhaps some thin soup. You work in the fields until exhaustion forces you to stop. You come home to more work around the cottage and animals. You eat a simple evening meal and you collapse into bed as soon as darkness makes further work impossible. This continues day after day, season after season, year after year, until your body breaks down from the constant labor and you die young, worn out and exhausted. But war makes everything incomparably worse. Fields can't be plowed or planted properly because you're worried about English raiders destroying your work before harvest. Crops that do grow might be burned or trampled by passing armies, both English and French, who see agricultural destruction as legitimate military strategy. Livestock that represents years of investment and breeding can be stolen or slaughtered in minutes by soldiers who need food or just want to deprive the enemy of resources. Tools and equipment essential for farming might be confiscated by military authorities or broken by soldiers using them for purposes they weren't designed for. The tax burden becomes crushing during wartime as both the French crown and the English occupiers in contested regions demand money and supplies to fund military operations. The French king needs revenue to pay soldiers and mercenaries, build fortifications and maintain armies in the field. English forces occupying French territory also demand payment from the peasants they've supposedly conquered. Meanwhile, both papal courts continue demanding ecclesiastical taxes regardless of the political and military situation. You're being taxed by multiple overlapping authorities,
none of which accept your poverty as excuse for non-payment, all of which threaten punishment ranging from confiscation of property to imprisonment to excommunication if you don't somehow produce money you don't have. Labor obligations increase because your lord needs to maintain his military equipment, pay for his participation in royal campaigns, and support the local garrison that's supposedly protecting the region, but which hasn't protected your village from the approaching English. You're required to spend more days working lord's land and fewer days working your own plot, which means less food for your family just when food security is most precarious due to war-related agricultural disruption. The gap between the labor you provide to the lord and the protection he provides in return grows wider. But complaining about this is dangerous when military conditions make lords more paranoid about disloyalty and more willing to use violence to enforce obedience. Food security, always precarious for medieval peasants, becomes a genuine survival crisis during wartime. Even in good years, peasant families typically have minimal surplus beyond what's needed for immediate survival and the next season's planting. A single bad harvest means hunger or starvation unless you can borrow grain at usurious rates that will take years to repay. During war, bad harvests are routine because fields are destroyed, labor is disrupted, tools are lost, and the general chaos makes normal agricultural cycles impossible to maintain. The starving time in late winter and early spring, when last year's stores are running low and new crops haven't come in yet, becomes a genuine threat to life rather than just a period of uncomfortable hunger. And just as you're trying to process how impossible daily survival has become, you hear screaming from outside. The English soldiers have reached your village and the destruction is beginning.
Two popes, double taxes, paying for religious civil war too. The immediate terror of the English raid somehow passes. Your village is looted and partially burned. Several people are killed or taken prisoner. Your food stores are confiscated. Your livestock stolen, but you and your immediate family survive, though traumatized and impoverished even by your previous standards of poverty. But surviving the military crisis just means returning to the grinding reality of daily existence, made worse by both the physical destruction and the ongoing spiritual crisis of the Great Schism that's draining what little resources remain. The economic impact of having two competing papal courts is staggering when you actually calculate the cost. The traditional tithe, 1/10 of your agricultural production going to the church, continues unchanged. But now there are additional special taxes and demands from both Rome-aligned and Avignon-aligned church authorities, who need money to fund their rivalry. The Rome Pope needs revenue to maintain his court in Italy, pay his supporters, and conduct his propaganda campaign against Avignon. The Avignon Pope needs even more money, because his lavish court in southern France has become notorious for luxury and excess that needs funding. Church fees and payments that were already burdensome in normal times multiplied during the schism. Baptism requires a fee to the priest, and now there's uncertainty about whether baptisms performed by priests loyal to the wrong pope are valid, leading some parents to pay for multiple baptisms to be safe. Marriage requires church approval and payment, with similar concerns about validity. Burial in consecrated ground requires payment, and during wartime when death rates spike, these fees become a significant burden on grieving families. Confession and absolution involve donations that are supposedly voluntary but which priests make clear are expected, and which increase during crisis periods when people are desperate for spiritual reassurance. Indulgences, the controversial practice of paying money to reduce time in purgatory or gain forgiveness for sins, become even more aggressive during the schism, as both papal courts use them as major revenue source. Traveling indulgence salesmen visit villages making extravagant promises about the spiritual benefits of purchasing their letters of indulgence, playing on fears of hell and purgatory that are very real to medieval people who genuinely believe in these concepts. The salesmen are often corrupt operators who keep most of the money for themselves rather than forwarding it to the papal courts. But peasants have no way to know they're being scammed and no recourse if they realize it later. The pressure to financially support your chosen pope is intense and comes from multiple sources. The local priest, following the bishop's directives, takes up special collections to support the Rome Pope's legitimate claim to the papacy. Your feudal lord, following the French crown's policy, demands additional payments to support the Avignon Pope's court and political agenda. Refusing either payment marks you as a heretic or traitor, with consequences that could include excommunication, loss of property, imprisonment or worse. You're trapped between competing religious and political authorities, each demanding money you don't have and threatening your soul or your life if you don't comply. But the financial burden is just one aspect of how the church's power affects every moment of your medieval existence, and the corruption visible during the schism reveals how much of that power is based on exploitation rather than spiritual truth. Indulgences and salvation for sale. The ultimate spiritual scam. The medieval Catholic Church's doctrine of purgatory creates a powerful mechanism for controlling behavior and extracting wealth from believers. According to church teachings, most souls go to purgatory after death, an intermediate state where sins are purged through suffering before the soul can enter heaven. The duration of suffering in purgatory can be reduced through prayers, good works, and especially through purchasing indulgences that draw on the treasury of merit built up by Christ and the saints. This system gives the church enormous power over people's ultimate fate while creating lucrative revenue stream from the sale of indulgences. In theory, indulgences aren't supposed to be pure financial transactions. They're meant to be part of a broader penitential process involving genuine contrition, confession, and penance. But in practice, especially during the schism when both papal courts desperately need money, indulgences become essentially get-out-of-hell cards that can be purchased with minimal spiritual preparation or genuine repentance. The marketing is aggressive and manipulative. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs, is an actual slogan used by indulgent salesmen, though it might be slightly anachronistic for the period you're in. The indulgent salesmen who visit your village are skilled at exploiting fear and grief. They tell stories about dead relatives suffering in purgatory, waiting for their living family members to purchase indulgences that will shorten their torment. They describe the horrors of purgatorial fire that's almost as bad as hell itself, except that it eventually ends. They offer special deals and bulk discounts. Buy an indulgence for your whole family, or purchase forgiveness for sins you haven't even committed yet, or invest in an indulgence that will protect you even if you die suddenly without time for proper confession and absolution. Your wife is desperate to buy indulgences for her 3 dead children, terrified that their innocent souls are suffering in purgatory despite their youth and sinlessness. But you can't afford the asking price without selling tools or livestock that you need for survival. The indulgent seller implies that refusing to spend money on your children's souls shows that you don't really love them and that God will judge your priorities when your own time comes. The emotional manipulation is cruel and effective. Some families go into debt they can never repay in order to purchase indulgences for deceased relatives, prioritizing the possibility of reducing purgatorial suffering over their own physical survival in this life. The Great Schism makes the indulgence system even more problematic because nobody knows which indulgences are valid. If you buy an indulgence from a Rome-aligned seller but the Avignon Pope is actually legitimate, has your money helped your soul at all, or have you just funded a false church? If you split your spending between both sides to cover your bases, are you committing the sin of simony, buying spiritual goods, or the sin of supporting heresy? The theological questions are genuinely complex, but the practical reality is that poor peasants are being manipulated into handing over money they desperately need to corrupt church officials who are getting rich off spiritual terror. And the broader corruption of the clergy from village priests to papal courts becomes impossible to ignore during the schism when the church's claims to spiritual authority are so obviously contradicted by the worldly behavior of its leader. Clergy corruption everywhere. When shepherds devour the flock. Father Bernard, your village priest, seems like a decent enough man who genuinely cares about his parishioners' spiritual welfare, but even he is compromised by the system he's part of. He's required to enforce church taxes and fees that he knows are crushing poor families. He must take positions on theological controversies, like which pope is legitimate, that he's not intellectually equipped to adjudicate and which have political consequences beyond his control. He's caught between his bishop's orders and his lord's expectations, between his desire to provide genuine spiritual guidance and the institutional pressure to maximize revenue for his ecclesiastical superior. Many priests are worse than Father Bernard, barely educated, appointed to their positions through nepotism or simony, buying church offices, more interested in the steady income and social status than in pastoral care, and treating their positions as sinecures rather than spiritual vocation. Some priests keep concubines in violation of celibacy rules, or father children they don't acknowledge, or spend parish funds on personal luxuries while their parishioners starve. The rule that priests should be celibate is widely ignored, and the higher you go in the church hierarchy, the more blatant the violations become. Bishops and higher church officials are typically from noble families who use church positions as career paths that don't require military service, allowing younger sons to gain wealth and power through ecclesiastical office. rather than through inheritance or warfare. Many bishops spend more time managing their estates, attending court and politicking than performing spiritual duties. They live in luxury that rivals or exceeds secular nobles, with fine clothes, elaborate meals, numerous servants, and impressive residences funded by the tithes and fees extracted from peasants who can barely feed their family. The papal courts in both Rome and Avignon are notoriously corrupt and luxurious. The Avignon papacy in particular has become infamous for its splendor, with the massive palace of the popes representing decades of construction funded by church revenues from across Europe. Cardinals live like princes, with huge households, expensive art and political influence that has nothing to do with spiritual matters. The sale of church offices summonee is routine and barely concealed. Positions from village priest to cardinal can be purchased by those with money and connection, ensuring that church leadership is filled with people selected for wealth and political loyalty rather than piety or spiritual wisdom. The contrast between the church's teachings about poverty, humility, and Christ-like behavior versus the actual lifestyle of church leadership is stark and impossible to miss. Priests preach sermons about the virtue of poverty while collecting tithes that fund bishops living in palaces. Church doctrine condemns greed and materialism while the institution itself is one of the largest landowners and wealthiest organizations in Europe. The message is clear. The rules apply to peasants who must give up their scarce resources to support clergy who are exempt from the very standards they're supposed to exemplify and enforce. And just when you think the church's corruption and the schism's chaos couldn't make your life worse, you receive news that the English are conducting another chevauchée through the region, and this time they're specifically targeting areas that haven't been thoroughly destroyed yet, like your partially rebuilt village.
Harvey Bay. The chevauchée terror. Systematic destruction. The strategy. The English chevauchée tactic isn't random violence or the accidental byproduct of military operations. It's deliberate policy designed to destroy France's economic capacity, terrorize the population, enrich English soldiers, and force the French crown to either fight disadvantageous battles or watch helplessly as its territory is devastated. The strategy was perfected by Edward the Black Prince during his brutal campaigns through southern France in the 1350s, and by the time you're experiencing it, it's become routine military practice that both sides, though primarily the English, employ with systematic brutality. The process is horrifyingly efficient. English forces march through French territory in a wide front, typically several thousand men spread across multiple columns, so they can cover more ground. They burn villages, destroy crops, slaughter or steal livestock, loot any valuables, take prisoners for ransom if the person seems wealthy enough, and move on to the next target before French forces can intercept them. The speed and mobility of these raids, combined with the English army's tactical advantages from longbow dominance, make it nearly impossible for the French to stop them without risking another devastating battlefield defeat like Crécy. Or the psychological impact is as important as the physical destruction. Peasants who survive one raid live in constant fear of the next one, which makes them less productive workers, less willing to invest in improving their holding, more likely to abandon their villages if they have any opportunity to flee elsewhere. The breakdown of normal agricultural cycles and investment patterns weakens the entire French economy, reducing tax revenues available to the crown and making it harder to fund defensive measures against future raids. It's a vicious cycle where each raid makes the next one more destructive, because there's less recovery time and fewer resources available. Your village's partial destruction during the previous raid was actually mild by chevauchée standards. The English were moving quickly and didn't spend much time on your small, poor village when there were richer targets ahead. But the intelligence reports carried by refugees from other regions suggest that this new raid is more thorough, with English forces specifically tasked with finishing the destruction of areas that were only partially damaged before. Your village is on the target list, and this time the English will burn everything, destroy all stored food, kill or steal every animal, and possibly massacre villagers, as an example to others. The knowledge that the English are coming again, with explicit orders to complete your destruction, creates a different kind of terror than the first raid. This isn't uncertainty about whether you'll be hit. It's certainty that everything will be destroyed, and the only question is whether you'll survive. When the English army comes, no mercy for civilians. The English arrive at dawn, surrounding your village before most people are awake. They've learned that surprise attacks at first light maximize confusion and minimize resistance, catching civilians before they can flee or hide valuable. You wake to shouting in English, Welsh, and Norman French, to the sound of wooden buildings being set on fire, to screaming from neighbors who've been caught trying to escape. The smoke is thick and acrid,
making it hard to breathe, and the heat from multiple fires is intense even though you're still inside your cottage trying to figure out what to do. But soldiers are already there, blocking escape routes and forcing villagers toward the open area near the village center, where the English commander wants everyone gathered for processing, determining who's worth taking prisoner for ransom, who might have hidden valuables worth torturing them to reveal, and who should just be killed or left to die in the burned ruins of their home. The English soldiers are professional and efficient in their brutality. They're not wild barbarians randomly destroying things. They're experienced raiders who know how to maximize both the destruction of French resources and their own personal enrichment from plunder. They move through the village systematically, checking every building, breaking open storage areas, confiscating or destroying food supplies, driving livestock toward collection points, and setting fires in patterns that ensure complete combustion of wooden structures. Some soldiers are specifically tasked with interrogating villagers about hidden valuables, the medieval equivalent of torture for information, using techniques from beatings to mutilation to threats against family members, to force disclosure of anything that might have been buried or concealed during the last raid. Your family has nothing valuable hidden because you never had anything valuable in the first place, but that doesn't stop soldiers from assuming you're lying and using violence to encourage honesty. The concept that some people are genuinely too poor to have anything worth stealing doesn't compute for soldiers accustomed to finding hidden wealth in supposedly impoverished villages. Women and children face particular horrors during the raid. Sexual violence is routine and barely worth mentioning in chronicles, except when it involves noble women, whose violation matters to male recorders of history. Your wife and daughters are in extreme danger from soldiers who view rape as legitimate spoil of war, and your only hope is that the raid moves quickly enough that soldiers don't take time for systematic assault, or that somehow your family can avoid attracting attention. Young boys might be taken as servants or squires if they seem healthy and trainable, which is form of slavery even if it's not called that, and even if it might offer better life than staying in destroyed village. The village center becomes a nightmare scene of fire, violence, crying children, wounded and dying villagers, English soldiers sorting through people and property, and the general atmosphere of apocalypse that comes from watching your entire world burn while being unable to stop it or protect anyone. Refugees and destroyed villages, nowhere left to go. The English have finished their work and moved on to the next target. Your village is effectively destroyed, with most buildings burned to foundations, all stored food confiscated or destroyed, every animal stolen or slaughtered, agricultural tools broken or and the general infrastructure of medieval village life eliminated. The human casualties are significant but not total, maybe a dozen dead from violence or fire, several seriously wounded who will likely die from infections or complications, and a few villagers taken prisoner for ransom or slavery. The survivors stand amid smoking ruins, traumatized and bereft, facing the reality that rebuilding would take years even if they had resources, which they don't. Your immediate survival needs are water, shelter, and food, in that order, and you have access to none of them in reliable ways. The well might be contaminated with bodies or deliberately poisoned by English soldiers practicing scorched earth tactics. The buildings that provided shelter are burned, leaving you exposed to weather that can be fatal in any season: freezing in winter, hypothermic rain in spring and fall, dehydrating heat in summer. The food supplies that might have sustained your family through the next few months are gone, and the next harvest is months away, assuming you could somehow plant crops in the destroyed fields without tools or seed grain. Some villagers want to flee to nearby towns or cities, hoping to find refuge and work as landless laborers, but that's risky for multiple reasons. Medieval towns are already overcrowded with refugees from other destroyed villages, and they're not welcoming to outsiders who represent additional mouths to feed without corresponding increase in productive capacity. Urban guilds control access to skilled trades, and you don't have the training or connections to break into those restricted economies. Your legal status as villains bound to your lord's land means that fleeing without permission is technically desertion or escape, which could lead to punishment if you're caught or if you later try to return. Others argue for staying and attempting to rebuild, gambling that the English won't return to a target they've already thoroughly destroyed, and hoping that the Lord will provide some assistance to restart agricultural production since he needs your labor even if he hasn't protected you adequately. But rebuilding requires resources, tools, seed grain, building materials, livestock, that nobody has after the raid, and getting into debt to obtain these necessities means generations of additional servitude to repay loans at usurious rates that will keep your descendants in bondage long after you're dead. A few desperate villagers consider banditry or joining one of the free companies of mercenaries and routiers who roam the countryside pillaging on their own account, but that's essentially becoming the thing you hate, the soldiers who destroyed your life, and it comes with high risk of violent death, execution if caught, and certain damnation of your soul according to church teaching. The moral calculus of survival versus sin is complex when the legitimate options are all death or slow starvation, and when predatory violence seems like the only way to feed your family. You're surrounded by crying children, traumatized family members, dead and wounded neighbors, and the smoking ruins of everything you knew, facing impossible choices about whether to flee or stay, to starve slowly or risk violence, to somehow maintain faith in God and church despite everything suggesting that the universe is cruel and indifferent to peasant suffering.
Black Death still lurking, the terror that never left. The Great Plague of 1347–1353 killed perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population, fundamentally changing medieval society in ways that are still being processed during the period you're experiencing. The immediate pandemic is over, but everyone alive is either a survivor who watched family members die horribly, or is too young to remember the plague, but grew up with the trauma and stories. And terrifyingly, the plague isn't gone. It's endemic now, flaring up in local outbreaks that can kill dozens or hundreds before mysteriously subsiding, only to return somewhere else months or years later. Your village, already devastated by the English raid and struggling with food shortage, is perfect breeding ground for disease of any kind. Malnutrition weakens immune systems, making people more susceptible to infections. The destruction of housing means people are crowded into makeshift shelters with poor ventilation and no sanitation. Bodies from the raid might not have been properly buried, creating health hazards. The general stress and trauma suppress immune function, and the rats and fleas that carry plague bacteria are thriving in the ruins where grain stores were broken open and organic debris provides perfect habitat. Someone in the village develops a fever and swollen lymph nodes, the characteristic buppos that give bubonic plague its name. An immediate panic spreads through the survivors. Is this plague returning? Will everyone die this time? Should people flee immediately even though they're injured and starving and have nowhere to go? Should the sick person be isolated or driven out of the village to protect everyone else? The medieval understanding of disease transmission is limited and often wrong, but the observation that plague seems to spread from person to person has led to crude quarantine practices that are often too late or too hard. Father Bernard, the village priest, faces impossible spiritual questions. Should he administer last rites to the sick person, risking his own infection, but potentially saving their soul? If he refuses out of fear, is he abandoning his pastoral duties and committing sin? If he gets sick and dies, who will provide sacraments to the rest of the village when others inevitably fall ill? The shortage of clergy during and after the Great Plague is still affecting many regions, with parishes going without priests for extended periods because so many clergy died during the pandemic and because surviving priests are stretched thin across multiple communities. And the terror of plague is compounded by medieval medical practice that's not just ineffective but actively harmful, often killing patients through treatments that are supposed to cure them. Medieval medicine that kills you faster. The sick villager with suspected plague receives medieval medical treatment that's based on humoral theory, the ancient Greek belief that health depends on balance between four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and that disease results from imbalance that must be corrected through treatments that seem logical within that framework, but which are actually dangerous nonsense from a modern medical perspective. Bloodletting is the first-line treatment for almost any condition in medieval medicine. The local barber surgeon, who's also the person who cuts hair, pulls teeth and performs minor surgery, opens a vein and drains significant amount of blood, reasoning that this will correct the humoral imbalance causing the fever and swelling. In reality, this weakens an already sick person, reducing their ability to fight infection and increasing likelihood of death. The procedure is done with poorly cleaned tools that might introduce additional infection, and if the patient dies, which is likely given that they have plague and are being weakened by bloodletting, medieval doctors conclude that the treatment was correct but applied too late or not aggressively enough. Purging is another standard treatment, administering strong laxatives and emetics to induce vomiting and diarrhea, again based on the theory that this will expel bad humors causing the illness. The result is severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance on top of whatever disease the patient is actually fighting, often pushing people who might have survived with supportive care into fatal dehydration and The fact that this treatment sometimes seems to work, people recover despite it, not because of it, reinforces medieval medical practitioners' confidence in approaches that modern medicine recognizes as actively harmful. Cauterization with hot irons is applied to the buboes, swollen lymph nodes,
causing excruciating pain and potentially spreading infection while doing nothing to treat the underlying bacterial infection that's actually causing plague. The reasoning is that burning will drive out the bad humors or putrefaction, but the reality is that you're torturing a dying person while making their final hours even more agonizing than disease alone would cause. Some plague victims who might have survived with rest and hydration instead die from shock and infection introduced by medieval treatments. Herbal remedies are the least harmful medieval medical interventions because while they're mostly ineffective, at least they usually don't actively kill you. Poultices made from various plants, drinks containing herbal infusions, prayer combined with medicinal herbs. These might provide some symptomatic relief through placebo effect, or in rare cases, through actual medicinal properties of certain plants that modern medicine has validated. That most herbal treatments are based on magical thinking, sympathetic magic or humoral theory rather than on empirical observation of what actually works. So even when the herbs chosen aren't harmful, they're unlikely to provide significant benefit. The combination of actual disease plus actively harmful medical treatment means that getting sick in medieval times is essentially a death sentence, unless you're robust enough to survive both the illness and the cure. Hygiene and disease everywhere. Living in filth. The broader sanitation and hygiene situation in medieval villages makes disease inevitable and widespread. There's no running water, no sewage systems, no understanding of germ theory or infection control, and cultural practices that would horrify modern public health officials. Your water comes from wells that might be contaminated with runoff from animal waste, human waste, and decomposing organic matter. You drink this water because you have no choice. And chronic low-level infections are normal background noise of medieval life that weakens everyone and kills the most vulnerable. Human waste disposal is primitive at best. There might be a communal latrine pit at the edge of the village, or people might just relieve themselves in fields or designated areas, with minimal concern for preventing contamination of water supplies or food preparation areas. The concept that human waste carries disease wouldn't be understood for centuries, so practices that seem obviously risky from modern hygiene perspective are just normal medieval life. Chamber pots are emptied out windows or doors, creating unsanitary conditions that attract flies, rats and other disease vectors. Personal hygiene is limited by lack of hot water, soap and cultural understanding of cleanliness. You might bathe a few times a year at most, changing your clothes infrequently because you own so few garments, and washing them is labor-intensive process requiring hauling water, heating it, and using harsh lye soap that damages fabric. Your body is constantly covered in sweat, dirt and grime that creates skin infections and harbors parasites. Your hair is home to lice that you can pick out but never fully eliminate. Your teeth rot from poor diet and lack of dental care, causing infections that can become life-threatening. The village environment is filled with disease vectors. Rats are everywhere, living in thatched roofs, grain stores and the organic debris that accumulates around medieval dwellings. Fleas that carry plague bacteria live on rats and also infest human clothing and bedding. Flies breed in animal waste and human waste, carrying bacteria from contaminated sources to food preparation areas. Mosquitoes breed in stagnant water and transmit malaria and other diseases. Parasitic worms are endemic from eating poorly cooked meat or from contamination of food by human waste. Animals live in close proximity to humans in ways that facilitate disease transmission. Your cottage might include a small barn area where livestock sleep, meaning you're breathing the same air as chickens, pigs, or goats that carry their own parasites and diseases that can cross species barriers. The pigs root around in organic waste, including human waste, and then might be slaughtered and eaten without thorough cooking that would kill parasites. Dogs and cats are everywhere, and are rarely treated for parasites or diseases that can affect humans. The cumulative effect of poor sanitation, inadequate hygiene, environmental contamination and proximity to disease vectors is that everyone is sick to some degree all the time, and epidemic disease finds fertile ground in populations already weakened by chronic infections and malnutrition.
Speaking medieval French, the language nobody teaches, Ace. Your attempts to communicate with your medieval family and neighbors are frustrated by the fact that you're trying to speak modern French, or English in a context where the language is radically different in pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, and usage patterns. Medieval French around 100 and 1400 is Middle French, transitioning from Old French but not yet the standardized modern French that you might have studied in school. The pronunciation is nearly incomprehensible to modern ears, sounds that don't exist in modern French, vowel shifts that make familiar words unrecognizable, consonant changes that alter entire words. The vocabulary includes many words that will disappear from the language, while lacking modern words for concepts and objects that don't exist yet. You can't discuss things using modern French vocabulary, because medieval people don't have words for the concepts. You can't explain internal combustion engines, antibiotics, democracy or human rights, because the language literally lacks the terminology, and creating new words to explain these concepts would require extensive circumlocution using medieval concepts that don't map well onto modern ideas. Grammar and syntax are different enough to cause constant misunderstandings. Word order variations that would sound archaic or wrong in modern French are normal in medieval usage. Verb conjugations and tenses have different patterns. The formal-informal distinction works differently, and the forms of address carry social meanings that you don't fully understand. Trying to speak proper French by modern standards marks you as strange and possibly foreign, which creates suspicion in a world where outsiders are viewed with distrust. Regional dialects add another layer of complexity. Medieval French isn't linguistically unified. There are numerous dialects and regional variations that can be almost mutually unintelligible to speakers from different areas. The Languedoc speaks Occitan, which is closer to Catalan than to French. Bretons speak Breton, a Celtic language completely unrelated to French. Your village probably has strong local dialect features that differ from the French spoken at court or in Paris, and you're struggling to understand, let alone reproduce, these local speech patterns that mark regional and social identity. And just when you think you're starting to grasp medieval French, you discover that religious life requires knowledge of Latin that you absolutely don't possess. Religious language and Latin. The Church's power through linguistic control. The Catholic Church conducts all official business, rituals and theological discussions in Latin, which is the universal language of Western European Christianity and scholarship, but which is completely inaccessible to the vast majority of people who don't have education in classical language. This linguistic barrier is both practical problem and tool of clerical power. Priests control access to sacred texts, religious knowledge and interpretation of doctrine, because they're the only people in most communities who can read and understand the Latin Bible, liturgy and church law. Mass is conducted entirely in Latin, with no translation or explanation of what's being said. There are no pews for common people in the church listening to the priest chant prayers in a language you don't understand, performing rituals whose significance isn't explained, generally experiencing the central act of Christian worship as incomprehensible mystery rather than meaningful spiritual practice. The Eucharist is consecrated with Latin words. Confessions are heard in Latin, though you confess in French and the priest translates, and all the power of the sacraments depends on Latin formulas that must be spoken correctly or the spiritual effect might be invalid. Your inability to verify what the priest is saying creates complete dependence on clerical authority. If the priest is corrupt, mistaken or lying about church doctrine, you have no way to check his claims against actual church teaching because you can't read the Latin source. If the priest tells you that you need to pay certain fees or perform certain penances or believe certain theological positions, you must either trust him or rebel against church authority with no way to appeal to higher knowledge. This information asymmetry is precisely why the church resists translation of the Bible into vernacular languages. Allowing common people to read scripture themselves would undermine clerical gatekeeping power. The few literate lay people in your village probably can read French but not Latin. Limiting them to non-religious texts or vernacular translations that are rare, expensive and potentially heretical if they interpret scripture in ways that conflict with official church teaching. The Waldensians and other reform movements that translate the Bible into local languages are condemned as heretics, partly because they're breaking the church's monopoly on scriptural interpretation and allowing common people to read and understand religious texts without clerical mediation. And beyond just religious language, the general illiteracy of medieval society creates a culture based on oral transmission, memory and trust, rather than on written documentation that modern people take for granted. Illiteracy and oral culture. When nothing is written down, you're almost certainly illiterate in this medieval context, as are roughly 90–95% of the population, and this has profound implications for how medieval society functions and how you experience daily life. Legal agreement, property boundaries, genealogies, historical events, technical knowledge and essentially everything that modern society documents in writing exists in medieval society only in human memory and oral tradition, which means it's subject to forgetting, misremembering and disputed interpretation.
Your legal rights and obligations as a villain are based on custom and memory rather than written contracts. The lord and village elders remember or claim to remember what the traditional obligations are, how many days of labor you owe, what fees you must pay, what rights you have to use common lands or resources. But there's no written document you can consult if there's a dispute, which means that powerful people can remember customs in ways that favor their interests, and you have no written evidence to contradict their claim. Property boundaries are maintained through memory and physical markers like stones, trees or ditches, rather than through surveyed maps and legal descriptions. Everyone knows where one family's plot ends and another begins, but these boundaries can shift over time as markers erode or are moved, and disputes must be resolved through testimony of elders who claim to remember the original boundaries from decades ago. Your modern concept of property rights based on precise documentation doesn't exist, replaced by a system of customary use that's flexible but also vulnerable to manipulation. Technical knowledge is transmitted orally from master to apprentice, parent to child, through demonstration and practice, rather than through written manuals or textbooks. You learn to plow by watching others plow and by trial and error. You learn agricultural timing by observing seasonal signs and following traditional wisdom passed down through generations. The lack of written documentation means that knowledge can be lost if the person who possesses it dies before passing it on, and innovations spread slowly because they must be demonstrated in person, rather than described in writing that could be copied and distributed. History and genealogy exist in oral traditions that are unreliable by modern standards. The village has stories about past events, about ancestors and their deeds, about how things used to be done in the old days. But these stories change with each retelling, contradictory versions exist, and there's no written record to adjudicate between competing claims about the past. Your family's history exists only in memory. You might know your parents and grandparents, but beyond that, ancestry becomes murky and uncertain unless your family is noble or important enough to have church records of births and death. The oral culture means that reputation and social memory are crucial. Since there are no credit reports, legal records or written documentation of your past behavior, your standing in the community depends entirely on people's memories of what you've done, what your family is like, and what your character seems to be. A damaged reputation can follow you your whole life, because people remember and tell stories, but there's also opportunity to reinvent yourself to some degree because memories fade, and can be contradicted by new behavior that overwrites old impressions. And this combination of linguistic barriers, illiteracy and oral culture, means that you're isolated from most knowledge and dependent on authorities who control information access, making it nearly impossible to verify religious claims, legal tradition, or historical narratives that shape your medieval life.
Women's brutal reality: property not partners. If you're female in this medieval scenario, your life is constrained by legal and social systems that treat you as fundamentally inferior to men and subject to male authority throughout your entire existence. As a child, you're under your father's authority. When you marry, which is expected and often arranged without your meaningful input, you transfer to your husband's authority. If your husband dies, you might briefly have some autonomy as a widow, but you'll likely come under the authority of your adult sons or male relatives who control your deceased husband's property. You're never truly independent or legally autonomous. Legally, you're considered unable to make contracts, own property independently, or represent yourself in court without male guardian or husband acting on your behalf. Any property you might theoretically inherit or earn belongs to your husband upon marriage. You cannot make binding agreements without your husband's approval. If you're wronged, your husband must seek legal remedy on your behalf because you lack legal standing to bring suit yourself. This legal subordination means you're essentially property that can be transferred, controlled, and exploited by the men who have authority over you. Your economic value as a woman is primarily your labor and reproductive capacity. You're expected to work as hard as men at agricultural labor, household production, textile work, and other tasks necessary for family survival, while also bearing and raising children, maintaining the household, and managing the domestic sphere that's considered women's natural domain. The combination of exhausting physical labor and frequent pregnancies breaks down women's bodies quickly. Many women die in childbirth, and those who survive multiple pregnancies are often physically destroyed by the constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, nursing, and hard labor. Marriage transforms you from your father's property to your husband's property, with your primary duties being obedience, domestic labor, and reproduction. You're expected to submit to your husband's authority in all matters, accept his decisions without argument, fulfill his sexual demands regardless of your own desires, and produce as many children as possible to provide heirs and laborers. Refusing your husband's sexual demands is not an option. The concept of marital rape doesn't exist because sex is considered a husband's legal right and a wife's obligation. Domestic violence is common and largely accepted as a husband's prerogative to discipline his wife, with intervention only occurring in extreme cases that threaten her life or that cause public scandal. The medieval Catholic Church's teachings reinforce women's subordination through religious doctrine that claims female inferiority is ordained by God. Arranged marriage and no choice. Your fate decided by others. Your marriage is arranged by your father or male guardian if your father is dead, in consultation with the prospective husband's family, with the primary considerations being economic alliance, social advantage, and practical compatibility of the families, rather than romantic attraction or personal compatibility of the couple. You might meet your future spouse briefly before the wedding, or you might not meet them until the wedding day itself. Your preferences about who you'd like to marry are irrelevant, unless they happen to align with what your father has already decided is in the family's best interest. The marriage negotiations involve dowry arrangements that determine what property, goods, or money your family will provide to establish you in your new household. If your family is too poor to provide adequate dowry, you might not be able to marry at all, leaving you in the uncertain and often despised position of unmarried woman dependent on your birth family's charity. If your family provides substantial dowry, you might have slightly more leverage to influence the choice of husband, but fundamentally your father is the one making the decision, based on what benefits him and the family rather than what makes you happy. The wedding ceremony involves your consent in theory. The church requires that both parties consent to the marriage, but in practice, the social pressure to accept the arranged match is enormous, and resistance is often futile. Refusing the marriage your father has arranged means defying parental authority, which is both sinful and potentially grounds for punishment, potentially impoverishing your family who has already made commitments based on the planned marriage, and marking yourself as disobedient and unmarriageable for the future. Most women consent because they understand they have no real alternative, unless they're willing to enter a convent, which also requires dowry, and which is often just another form of arranged life. Your relationship with your spouse is hierarchical rather than egalitarian. Your husband has legal authority over you, control of any property or earnings, the right to discipline you physically, and expectations of obedience that are enforced by law, church teaching, and social pressure. The romantic ideal of marriages based on mutual love and respect exists in courtly poetry and noble fantasies, but the reality for peasant women is that marriage is an economic and reproductive partnership, where affection, if it develops at all, is a fortunate bonus rather than a prerequisite or expectation. And the physical realities of medieval marriage for women are brutal in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Domestic life and survival, when home means danger, tending fires, cooking over open flames that can cause burns, and dealing with smoke inhalation that damages your lungs over years of exposure. You're making and maintaining all clothing for the family, which involves spinning thread, weaving cloth, sewing garments, and repairing worn items, in a never-ending cycle of textile production that consumes whatever time isn't already occupied by cooking, childcare, and agricultural work. Childbearing is particularly dangerous in medieval conditions. You'll likely become pregnant soon after marriage, and repeatedly afterward, and each pregnancy carries significant risk of maternal death during childbirth, or from postpartum complications. Medieval obstetrics is primitive and often harmful, with midwives having traditional knowledge that's sometimes helpful, but which lacks understanding of infection control, anatomy, or how to handle serious complications. If labor goes wrong, if the baby is positioned badly, if there's hemorrhaging, if infection develops, you'll likely die because the interventions that could save you won't be invented for centuries. Infant and child mortality mean you'll probably watch several of your children die, even if you survive multiple childbirths. Perhaps only half of the children you bear will survive to adulthood. You'll bury babies who died from infections, diseases, accidents, or malnutrition that modern medicine could have prevented or treated. The grief is constant and cumulative, and you're expected to simply accept these deaths as God's will, and continue bearing more children to replace the ones you've lost. Domestic violence is common and has limited recourse. If your husband beats you, the community generally considers it his right unless he's causing injuries so severe they threaten your life or your ability to work. The church church preaches that wives should submit to husbands, and that marriage is indissoluble, except in rare cases of annulment that require expensive legal proceedings and specific grounds, usually non-consummation or too close blood relationship. You can't just leave an abusive marriage. You have nowhere to go, no legal status without a husband, and no way to support yourself independently in a society that doesn't recognize women's autonomy. Sexual assault by soldiers or other men outside your family is a constant threat during wartime, and if it happens, you might be blamed for tempting men or failing to protect yourself. The concept of rape as a crime against the woman herself doesn't really exist. It's viewed more as a property crime against her father or husband, and if you're a peasant woman raped by noble or soldier, there's effectively no legal remedy because your social status means your violation doesn't matter to authorities. You're expected to continue functioning bearing the psychological trauma silently because there's no concept of trauma counseling or recognition that sexual violence causes lasting harm. And while you're enduring all these hardships, specific to being female in medieval society, the broader crisis of famine and food shortage that affects everyone is making survival even more precarious.
War destroys crops. The agricultural collapse. The English chevauchés have systematically destroyed agricultural infrastructure across wide swaths of French territory, creating food shortages that go beyond simple hunger to genuine famine conditions that kill through starvation and through the diseases that flourish in malnourished populations. Fields have been burned during growing season, destroying crops before harvest. Grain stores have been confiscated or burned, eliminating the surplus that normally carries communities through winter and provides seed for next year's planting. Livestock has been stolen or slaughtered, removing the draft animals needed for ploughing and the animals that provide meat, milk and eggs. Agricultural tools have been broken or stolen during raids, and replacing them requires money or barter goods that devastated communities don't possess. Plows, harrows, scythe, and other implements aren't mass-produced items you can order online. They're individually made by skilled craftsmen using materials that are expensive and hard to obtain during wartime, when trade is disrupted. A family that loses its tools might not be able to replace them for years, meaning they can't farm effectively, even if they have land and seed grain available. The timing of English raids is deliberately chosen to maximize agricultural damage. Burning fields just before harvest destroys an entire year's work and the food that would have sustained families through the coming year. Raids during ploughing season prevent proper field preparation, reducing yields even if crops eventually get planted. Stealing draft animals in spring means fields can't be ploughed at all, forcing manual labor that's inadequate for the acreage that needs cultivation. The cumulative effect of multiple raids over several years is near total collapse of agricultural production in affected regions. The manorial system that normally provides some buffer against localized food shortages is breaking down under the stress of war. Lords who would traditionally help villeins in crisis by providing seed grain or tools on credit are themselves impoverished by war costs, inability to collect rents from destroyed villages, and their own obligations to hire feudal authority. The reciprocal relationship where lords protect and support their peasants in exchange for labor and rents is revealed as a fiction when crisis makes it clear that lords prioritize their own survival and that peasant welfare is expendable, and the result is famine conditions that you're experiencing directly through constant, gnawing hunger that never stops. Starvation becomes normal, living on the edge of death. The hunger you're experiencing isn't the mild discomfort of missing a meal that modern people in developed countries occasionally feel. It's severe caloric deficit that's sustained over months, weakening your body, impairing your cognitive function, making you constantly obsessed with food, and gradually killing you through starvation and the complications that come with prolonged malnutrition. Your body is consuming its own muscle tissue for energy, making physical labor increasingly difficult even though you must continue working to have any hope of growing food. Your immune system is compromised, making you vulnerable to every infection and disease that circulates through the malnourished population. The physiological effects of starvation are devastating. You're constantly cold because your body doesn't have enough fuel to maintain normal temperature, and you lack the fat reserves that insulate against cold. You're weak and dizzy, with difficulty concentrating or performing complex tasks. Your hair is falling out. Your skin is developing sores and rashes. Your gums are bleeding from scurvy and other nutritional deficiencies. Children in the village have distended bellies from kwashiorkor or protein deficiency, stick-thin limbs, and the vacant expressions of people whose brains aren't receiving adequate nutrition for normal development. The psychological effects are equally severe. You're irritable and short-tempered from constant hunger. You have difficulty thinking clearly or making good decisions. You're obsessed with food, thinking about it constantly, dreaming about feasts, feeling envious and resentful toward anyone who seems to have more to eat than you do. The social bonds that normally hold communities together fray under the stress of scarcity, with families hoarding what little food they have and viewing neighbors as competitors for inadequate resources, rather than as fellow community members. The moral calculus of survival becomes impossible. Do you feed your children the small amount of food you have, knowing it's not enough to sustain them but hoping it will at least delay death? Or do you eat it yourself to maintain your strength for work that might generate more food, even though that means watching your children starve? Do you share with neighbors who are worse off than you, fulfilling Christian obligations of charity but reducing your own family's survival chance? Or do you hoard everything, betraying communal values but potentially giving your family a slightly better chance of making it through the famine? And the desperation of hunger drives people to consume things that humans shouldn't eat, with consequences that range from sickness to death. Eating things you shouldn't, famine foods of desperation. When normal food sources are exhausted, starving people turn to increasingly desperate alternatives that cause their own health problems. Bark from trees can be ground up and mixed with what little flour you have, extending the food supply but providing almost no nutritional value, and causing digestive problems. Grass and leaves can fill your stomach temporarily but don't provide the calories or nutrients needed for survival, and can cause intestinal blockages. Acorns, which are normally pig feed, can be processed to remove bitter tannins and made into crude bread, but the process is labor-intensive and the resulting food is barely palatable and nutritionally poor. Roots and plants that are normally avoided because they're marginally toxic become food sources when there's no alternative. Things that cause mild stomach upset or have unpleasant taste suddenly seem acceptable when the choice is eating them or starving. Some of these famine foods are genuinely dangerous, causing poisoning that kills or causes permanent health damage, but desperate people take the risk because immediate starvation is a certainty while poisoning is only a possibility. Animals that are normally considered inedible get consumed. Rats, which are abundant in grain storage areas even when grain is scarce, become protein sources despite the risk of disease transmission. Dogs and cats, which are normally kept for working purposes rather than as food, are slaughtered and eaten when nothing else is available. Leather items, shoes, belts, harnesses, are boiled to extract whatever nutritional value might remain in the animal hides, producing foul-tasting but marginally caloric substance that keeps people alive a few more days. The most horrifying desperation is cannibalism, which does occur during severe famines, though it's rarely documented because it's so taboo. Stories circulate about people eating corpses, or in the worst cases killing others for food. These might be exaggerations or propaganda meant to emphasize the horror of famine conditions, but they might also reflect terrible reality that some people, driven mad by starvation, cross the ultimate moral boundary. The fear that your neighbors might kill and eat you adds psychological terror to the physical suffering of hunger. And while you're struggling to survive the famine created by war, you also have to contend with the military culture that's making everything worse. A culture of knights and nobles who claim to be Christian heroes but who are actually predatory exploiters.
Knights aren't noble heroes, predators in armor. The medieval ideal of knighthood as represented in chivalric romances and courtly literature bears almost no relationship to the reality of how actual knights behave, especially during the crisis period of the 100 Years' War, when military necessity and economic desperation have stripped away any pretense of noble behavior. Knights are violent men, trained from youth in warfare, given expensive equipment and social status that sets them above common people, and effectively licensed to use force to extract resources from peasants who can't defend themselves against armored, mounted warriors with professional military training. The chivalric code that supposedly governs knightly behavior is primarily concerned with relations between knights and with how knights treat noble women. It has almost nothing to say about how knights should treat peasants, except that they shouldn't be so brutal that it provokes rebellion. Knights are expected to be brave in battle against other knights, to show mercy to defeated noble enemies who can pay ransom, to protect noble ladies, to be loyal to their feudal lords, and to maintain their honor as defined by aristocratic standards. There's no requirement to treat peasants with any particular consideration, and in practice, knights view common people as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed, rather than as people with inherent worth. Your direct experiences with knights have all been negative. When knights from your lord's household collect rents and fees, they're armed and threatening, making clear that failure to pay will have violent consequences. When English knights raid during chevauchée, they burn, loot, kill and destroy with professional efficiency and no apparent guilt or remorse. When French knights pass through the village requisitioning supplies for military campaigns, they take what they want without fair payment and threaten violence against anyone who resists or complains. The armor, weapons, and horses that mark knights as military elite are tools of oppression as much as they're tools of war. The economic relationship between knights and peasants is fundamentally exploitative.
Knights don't produce food or goods themselves. They extract resources from peasants through feudal obligations, rent, taxes, and sometimes simple theft disguised as legitimate requisition. The military protection that knights supposedly provide in exchange for peasant support is often inadequate, late or non-existent, as you've learned watching English forces destroy your village while your lord's knights are elsewhere. The system depends on peasant labor to fund knightly lifestyle, and when war disrupts agricultural production, knights respond by increasing pressure on peasants rather than by reducing their own consumption. And the specific military practices of knights during the 100 Years' War reveal how far actual behavior deviates from chivalric ideals, ransoms and prisoners. War as business model. Medieval warfare among the nobility is as much about profit as about military or political objectives. Capturing enemy knights for ransom is more lucrative than killing them, creating incentives for knights to try to take noble prisoners alive while showing no mercy to common soldiers who aren't worth ransoming. A captured French knight might be worth several years' income if his family can be forced to pay ransom, while a captured peasant conscript is worthless, and therefore likely to be killed or simply left to die without anyone caring about his fate. The ransom system creates perverse incentives that prolong warfare. Knights on both sides benefit financially from continued conflict that generates opportunities to capture wealthy enemies, so there's no economic reason for individual knights to want peace, even if their kingdoms would benefit from ending the war. Captured nobles are typically treated well by their captors, given comfortable accommodations, allowed to interact socially with their captors as fellow aristocrats, and eventually released upon payment of ransom that financially devastates their families but which preserves their lives and honor. Common soldiers and peasants caught in war zones enjoy no such protections. You're not worth capturing for ransom, so enemy soldiers have no economic incentive to keep you alive if you resist or if killing you is convenient. If you're taken prisoner during a raid, it's not for ransom but rather for temporary enslavement. You might be forced to carry plunder, to labor on fortifications, or to serve as hostage to ensure a village's cooperation before eventually being released or killed, depending on your captor's mood and circumstance. The contrast between how aristocratic prisoners and common prisoners are treated reveals the class hierarchy's brutal reality. A captured knight lives comfortably, maintains his social status, and can expect eventual release upon ransom payment. A captured peasant is property to be used and discarded, with no legal protections, no rights and no hope of ransom because nobody who matters cares whether you live or die. The chivalric code's protections extend only to people who matter in the medieval social hierarchy, and peasants simply don't matter in ways that would trigger those protections. And the specific battles and military disasters of the 100 Years' War demonstrate how the noble military system fails repeatedly while peasants pay the price. Battle of Agincourt and military disasters. When nobles fail, the major battles of the 100 Years' War have demonstrated that French knightly tactics are inadequate against English longbow tactics, yet French nobles continue using the same failed approaches because their military culture values individual glory and traditional methods over practical effectiveness. At Crusade, English longbowmen slaughtered French knights who charged directly into defensive positions without adequate reconnaissance or tactical planning. At Poitiers in 1356, the French king himself was captured along with much of his nobility in another devastating defeat that revealed French tactical incompetence. These disasters should have prompted military reform, but aristocratic culture resists change that would diminish knightly status. The Battle of Agincourt in 1450, which is probably after your current timeline but which follows the same pattern, will be another catastrophic French defeat where noble overconfidence and poor tactics lead to massive casualties among French aristocracy, while English forces suffer minimal losses. French knights, despite knowing about English longbow effectiveness, will charge across muddy terrain that bogs down their horses, bunch up in confined space where they can't maneuver, and present perfect targets for English archers. Thousands of French nobles will die or be captured, while their peasant conscripts are slaughtered without anyone bothering to count their losses because common soldiers don't matter in aristocratic accounting of military disaster. The pattern is consistent. Noble military culture prioritizes individual glory, heroic charges, and traditional tactics over practical effectiveness, and when these approaches fail against English longbow tactics or other innovations, nobles blame bad luck, divine disfavor, or traitors rather than acknowledging that their military system is fundamentally flawed. Peasant conscripts are sent into battles they have no hope of winning, with inadequate equipment and training, to die in service of noble military adventures that benefit peasants not at all regardless of whether France or England win. And while nobles are failing at warfare while claiming to be military experts, they're also failing to provide the protection and governance that supposedly justifies their privileged position in feudal society.
Living near Papal Palace.
Proximity to corruption. If your village is in southern France, you might be relatively close to Avignon, where the papal court has established itself in luxury that contrasts starkly with the poverty of surrounding countryside. The Palace of the Popes in Avignon is one of the largest and most impressive buildings in Europe, a massive Gothic fortress palace that took decades to complete, and which houses the elaborate papal court with its hundreds of officials, servants and hangers-on. The construction was funded by church revenues extracted from poor Christians across Europe through tithes, fees and special taxes, representing the transfer of wealth from peasants who can barely feed their families to a religious court living in unprecedented luxury. The contrast between papal wealth and peasant poverty is impossible to miss if you're anywhere near Avignon. The papal court consumes vast quantities of expensive food, fine wines, luxurious textiles and imported goods, while peasants in surrounding villages are starving from war-induced famine. Cardinals and high church officials dress in fine robes, live in elaborate palaces, maintain large households with numerous servants, and generally live like princes while preaching sermons about Christian humility and the spiritual virtues of poverty that they conspicuously don't practice themselves. The papal court's demand for supplies creates economic distortion in the region. Local agriculture is oriented toward producing luxury goods for papal consumption rather than staple foods for common people's survival. Peasants are pressured to grow grapes for wine, raise expensive cuts of meat, and provide other luxury items that the papal court demands even when they themselves are going hungry. The ecclesiastical taxes and fees extracted from local populations fund the extravagant lifestyle of church officials who seem to have forgotten that Christianity began as a religion of the poor and dispossessed. The visible corruption and luxury of the papal court makes the schism's theological argument seem irrelevant compared to the obvious material interests driving the conflict: wealth versus poverty. The Church's broken promise. The fundamental promise of the medieval Church is that earthly suffering will be rewarded with heavenly joy, that the poor and oppressed who endure their lot patiently will be exalted in the afterlife, while the rich and powerful who exploit them will face divine judgment. Blessed are the meek. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. The last shall be first. These gospel teachings are central to Christianity's appeal to poor and suffering people who need to believe their current misery has spiritual meaning and compensation. But the reality of the Church as an institution contradicts these teachings in ways that are impossible to ignore during the schism when two papal courts are competing for wealth and power. The Church is one of the largest landowners in Europe, extracting rents from peasant tenants just like secular lords do. Church officials live in luxury funded by tithes from people who are starved. The clergy who preach about spiritual poverty are themselves wealthy and comfortable, having taken religious vows that don't prevent them from enjoying material abundance. The contradiction between Christian teachings and church practice is so obvious that it fuels heretical movements questioning whether the institutional church has any connection to genuine Christianity. Your personal experience of church financial demands while you're struggling to survive creates cognitive dissonance that's hard to resolve. The priest tells you that paying tithes is necessary for your salvation and that supporting the church is God's command, but you're watching your children go hungry while church officials live comfortably. The church claims to care for the poor and to provide charity, but the charity is inadequate compared to the wealth the church extracts, and it's distributed at the church's discretion rather than as a right that poor people can claim. The system is designed to transfer resources from peasants to clergy while providing just enough spiritual comfort and occasional material aid to prevent complete rejection of church authority. And church buildings while peasants live in hovels raises obvious questions about priorities. Cathedrals take decades or centuries to complete, employing hundreds of workers and consuming vast resources that could have fed, clothed or housed poor people. The justification is that these buildings glorify God and provide spaces for worship, but they also glorify the bishops and wealthy donors who funded them and who are memorialized in the architecture and decoration. The beauty of religious art and architecture is real, but it's created through extraction of resources from people who are suffering and who don't benefit from living near beautiful buildings they're too poor and exhausted to appreciate. And the political machinations of the papal court reveal that spiritual concerns are secondary to earthly power struggles. Papal politics and intrigue, when religion becomes power game disputes or religious authority. The Avignon papacy exists because French kings wanted to control the church for their own political purposes, And the Roman papacy exists because Italian and German powers wanted to prevent French domination of Christianity. The competing popes excommunicate each other not primarily because of doctrinal differences but because each claims exclusive legitimate authority that the other's existence contradicts. The cardinals who support each pope do so partly from religious conviction but also from political calculation about which papal court offers better career opportunities and rewards. The papal court is filled with political intrigue, faction fight, and corruption that resembles secular royal courts more than religious institutions dedicated to spiritual matters. Cardinals compete for influence and position, forming alliances and betraying rivals in pursuit of power and wealth. Decisions about church policy are made based on political considerations rather than theological principles. Appointments to church offices are bought and sold, with wealthy families paying enormous sums to secure positions for their relatives. The veneer of religious language and ceremony barely conceals the naked ambition and material calculation driving papal politics. Your village's choice of which pope to support isn't really about theological judgment. You're not qualified to adjudicate complex ecclesiastical legal argument about papal election validity. It's about political survival within power structures that demand loyalty but can't definitively prove which authority is legitimate. Supporting the Rome Pope might be religiously correct but politically dangerous if your local lord supports Avignon. Supporting the Avignon Pope might be politically safe but spiritually risky if Rome turns out to be the legitimate papacy. The impossible choice reflects the breakdown of the unified Christian authority structure that's supposed to provide clear guidance and instead creates paralyzing uncertainty. And while you're watching the church tear itself apart in pursuit of power and wealth, you're also trying to survive another winter that might kill you even if war and famine don't.
Medieval winter death sentence without preparation. Winter in medieval France is an existential threat that kills significant portion of population every year through cold exposure, starvation, and diseases that flourish in malnourished populations. Confined indoors with inadequate heating and ventilation. Modern people with central heating, insulated houses, winter clothing, and abundant food supplies can barely comprehend how dangerous and miserable medieval winter is for peasants who lack all these protections against cold that can kill in hours or days of exposure. Your cottage provides minimal protection against winter cold. The walls are stone or wattle and daub, woven branches covered with mud and straw, which offer some wind protection but minimal insulation. The thatched roof leaks and allows heat to escape. There are gaps around the door and shutters that let in frigid air. The earthen floor radiates cold upward. The only heat source is the central fire, which provides warmth in immediate vicinity, but which leaves the rest of the single room frigidly cold. At night, when the fire dies down to conserve fuel, the interior temperature might not be much warmer than outside, meaning you're essentially camping indoors in below freezing conditions. Your clothing is inadequate for serious cold. You have one or maybe two sets of wool garments that provide some insulation when dry, but which lose effectiveness when damp from snow, rain, or sweat. You don't have the multiple layers, waterproof outer garments, insulated boots, or other specialized cold weather gear that modern people take for granted. Your shoes are leather that might be stuffed with straw for minimal insulation, but which get wet easily and then freeze, giving you frostbite if you have to work outside in winter conditions. You might have a cloak or blanket, but it's not enough to keep you warm through winter nights in an unheated cottage. And the food shortage that was already critical becomes catastrophic during winter when agricultural work stops and survival depends entirely on stored provisions that are inadequate. No heat, no food, no hope. The triple threat: the firewood supply is never adequate for maintaining comfortable warmth throughout winter. Gathering firewood requires enormous labor during summer and fall, and you need literally tons of wood to heat even a small cottage for several months. The forest where firewood should come from might be your lord's private hunting ground, where gathering wood without permission is considered poaching, subject to severe punishment. The English raids might have destroyed your woodpile or prevented you from gathering adequate supplies during preparation season. Every piece of wood you burn brings you closer to the end of your supply, forcing impossible choices between staying warm now and conserving fuel for later in winter when cold might be even more deadly. The food stored from last harvest, assuming the English didn't destroy or confiscate it all, is running low by midwinter. Your family is eating minimal rations to stretch supplies, but even so, the math is clear that you won't have enough to last until spring crops come in. The starving time in late winter and early spring is when food stores are exhausted but new growth isn't available yet.
And this year it will be worse than usual because war disrupted last year's harvest. You're watching your children grow thinner and weaker, knowing that some of them probably won't survive until spring, forced to make horrific decisions about how to distribute inadequate food among family members you all love equally. The psychological impact of winter confinement in dark, cold, crowded conditions with inadequate food creates its own health crisis. Seasonal affective disorder affects people who spend months in darkness without adequate sunlight. Cabin fever from being confined indoors with family members you can't escape from creates tension and conflict. The constant cold, hunger and discomfort wear down mental health and willpower. Some people simply give up, lying in bed and waiting to die rather than continuing the struggle to survive conditions that seem insurmountable. The despair is contagious, making it harder for others to maintain hope when they see family and neighbors surrendering to death. And the diseases that flourish in winter conditions are killing people who might have survived if they were well fed and warm, freezing and starving together. When family becomes burden, the combination of cold and hunger kills through multiple mechanisms. Hypothermia, when your body can't maintain core temperature and you literally freeze to death in your sleep. Starvation, when caloric intake drops so low that your body shuts down essential functions. Pneumonia and respiratory infections that flourish in cold, damp conditions and that weakened immune systems can't fight off. The synergistic effect of cold plus hunger is worse than either alone. Cold increases caloric needs precisely when food is scarcest, and hunger reduces your ability to generate body heat, creating a deadly spiral that kills the weakest family members first: infants, elderly, and the already sick. You wake up one morning to find that your youngest child didn't survive the night. They simply stopped breathing in their sleep, the cold and hunger proving too much for their small body to overcome. This happens regularly in medieval winter, so often that there's established rituals and procedures for dealing with frozen infant corpses. The ground is too frozen to dig graves, so bodies must be stored somewhere until spring thaw allows burial. Your grief is real and profound, but it's also something you have to set aside quickly because you have other children who need care and because breaking down emotionally is a luxury you can't afford when survival requires constant effort. The elderly in your household are also at risk. Your father or father-in-law who survived to old age, maybe 60 years old, ancient by medieval peasant standards, is not going to survive this winter. He's too weak to generate adequate body heat, too sick from chronic conditions to fight off the pneumonia that's settled in his lungs, and too much of a drain on food supplies that could keep younger, more viable family members alive. There's no one moment when you decide to let him die, but there's a gradual withdrawal of care and resources, giving him smaller food portions, less space near the fire, subtle signals that his continued survival isn't the priority when hard choices must be made about resource allocation. The moral weight of these decisions is crushing even though they're rational within the brutal logic of survival. You're choosing which family members live and which die, prioritizing able-bodied workers and young children, with futures over elderly and infant dependents who consume resources without contributing. The fact that these choices make practical sense doesn't make them less psychologically devastating. You'll carry the guilt of these decisions for the rest of your life, knowing that you effectively killed family members through calculated neglect, even though feeding everyone equally would have meant everyone dying together. And just when you think winter can't possibly get worse, news arrives that makes the religious crisis even more complicated and insane. And suddenly you're awake, back in your modern bed, with soft mattress and warm blankets, not on straw infested with lice. You hear the hum of central heating, not the crackle of dying fires. You smell nothing but clean sheets and perhaps coffee brewing, not the overwhelming stench of medieval filth, smoke, and unwashed bodies. Was it a dream? A vision? Time travel? You don't know, and it doesn't matter, because you're back, and the relief is overwhelming. You lived through the Great Schism, with its 3 competing popes and impossible spiritual crisis. You survived the 100 Years' War's devastation of French countryside. You endured famine, winter, disease, and feudal exploitation that killed most people before age 40. The modern world around you seems like paradise. You won't starve today. You won't freeze to death tonight. No soldiers will burn your home. No church officials will threaten you with hell unless you pay taxes to competing popes. You have rights, freedom, medicine, food, warmth, and a future that isn't determined by the accident of your birth into serfdom. So hey, still awake after that medieval nightmare? Drop a comment. Which would be worse, living through the Great Schism's religious chaos, or surviving the 100 Years' War? Could you have made it through a medieval winter with no heat and no food? Hit like if this story made you appreciate central heating, modern medicine, and not having to choose between 3 different popes. Subscribe for more historical nightmares that make you grateful for living in the 20th. Share with someone who romanticizes medieval times and needs to understand what it was actually like. Sweet dreams. And when you wake up tomorrow in your warm house with food in the refrigerator, maybe take a moment to appreciate that you're not a 14th century peasant facing starvation, war, religious terror, and early death. Because the Middle Ages weren't a fairy tale, they were a survival horror that most people didn't survive.